probably the greatest of the Dutch artists from the 17th century. And in fact, I just came back from England where I gave a talk at the Kenwood House, one of the great museums. It's a house museum right in London that owns this painting, one of Rembrandt's greatest self-portraits from the end of his life. And we'll talk a little bit about that toward the end of this particular lecture. But I've entitled this talk, Rembrandt, A Lifelong Search of Self. This is the Rembrandt year, shall I say. It's the 350th anniversary of his death. So there's all kinds of exhibitions that have been held this year and programs, and that's why they had me come over to London to give a talk. In fact, it was a group of cartographers from the map room at the British Museum, where I've done a lot of work. Many of you know my topic for my dissertation was wall maps and paintings in the Golden Age. And it was pretty exciting to be with some of these people I hadn't seen for 40 years. But the reason they had me come was to talk about this particular portrait, which I'll get into at the end. What are the circles in that behind Rembrandt there? Some people have thought it's a wall map. And I'll probably show you that it isn't a wall map, but it's still trying to guess what it is. So let's get started. Rembrandt's self-portraits are truly amazing. He did them throughout his life. He probably has more self-portraits than any artist alive. Maybe up until recently with photography. You probably have more selfies than Rembrandt made. But his life was 63 years long, and it was filled with highs and lows. And in many ways, these self-portraits are really his biography. It's interesting to know that we have only a couple sentences from Rembrandt. And think how much, certainly we have a lot of documents, for example, when he declared bankruptcy and all those kinds of things, but only a couple words that he actually wrote. And yet we feel we know this man, mainly from his images. About 10% of his total oeuvre, or output, are self-portraits. Now, take for example someone like Rubens, a contemporary. We have about maybe 6 or 7 self-portraits. So it's much more than any other artist of that period as well. Here you see the etchings that he did, and as with the paintings, they're mainly from the first years of his career and the latter years of his career. And they have them roughly arranged left to right, from top to bottom, in terms of years. We have only a handful of drawings. In fact, those are the only 5 that we're certain of. There were undoubtedly many, many more. But why so few? Probably so many were lost, for example, in fires. Whereas prints, I'm sure a lot of prints were lost in fires as well, but you have many more copies of a print. The drawing is unique. Paintings, because they're oil on canvas or on panel, they probably have a better survival rate than a work on paper. And then the paintings. About 40, and people still quibble about which are original, but with a lot of the scientific research, the whole project that was taking place during the second half of the 20th century, we have really narrowed that down. And these are the portraits from roughly the first years of his career. Again, put in a chronological order there. And these are the ones toward the end of his life, many of them from the last 4 years of his life. We also don't know if they were really completed, including the one we started out with, because they were found in his studio. What is interesting is that there were very few self-portraits found in his studio. So they were sold and were collected in his lifetime. Rembrandt was really famous in his life. He never left Holland, but he was well known in Italy and all around. He's also an artist who never fell out of favor in subsequent generations or centuries, whereas people like the other 2 great masters that we always refer to, Frans Hals and Vermeer, were not overlooked in the 18th and the 19th century, until the second half of the 19th century, particularly Vermeer, who was rediscovered then. Frans Hals, they thought he was an alcoholic, and because his brushwork was so, quote, sloppy, we love that today. He could never have painted the works and so skillfully if he was drinking all day long. But someone went to his studio one day and saw him drinking everyone drank beer in those days, safer than the water. And then he got the reputation of being drunk simply because people had a hard time accepting his very free brushwork. Rembrandt's self-portraits are really, in many ways, I want to say a performance, as anyone's self-portrait is. Think about it. Portraiture in general, that's why I love teaching this class at Holy Cross. It's so interesting a subject to think about. First of all, you're the only one who doesn't see yourself. So think about that regarding self-portraits. And you're changing all the time. You are not the same person as when you enter the room. Hopefully you know something more about Rembrandt, for example. Also, when it's a portrait of someone else, there are three people involved, right? There is the sitter, let's call it, the stander, the artist, and then the viewer. And they're never the same. We're changing as viewers, and a viewer from the 20th century looks at these paintings, portraits from the 17th century differently than someone in the period. For example, we look at them, say, post-Freud, we think of all the psychology of the person. But someone in the 17th century would be much more familiar with the clothing and would know, oh, how that feels, or is it fashionable, or is it not? In fact, when I was in London, I should be careful when I bring something like this up. Well, in London or in New England as well, where we have sort of a habit of hanging on to our clothes, right? And I said, for example, are you still wearing the same clothes that you wore 20 years ago? Or maybe you are, and maybe it's vintage clothing. No hands went up, and I'm sure no one's going to raise their hand now. But we do collect, now it's fashionable to wear vintage clothing. At the end of that evening, we had a reception in one of the galleries, and the president of the board of the Friends of the Kenwood House came up to me and said, I am wearing vintage clothing. My daughter bought it for me. Isn't it cool? But the thing is, they were so sensitive to what they're wearing, as you are too. Even if it's vintage clothing, it's chic again. But that's something we wouldn't appreciate as much just looking at it several centuries later. And then, of course, the person is changing all the time. And most important is that it's the same person who created the work of art. Okay? So this is how that person wants to be seen. Think about it as a performance. That's what I like to think about it. As you're going to the theater, whenever I go to Washington, D.C. and I go to the National Gallery, I always stand for a while in front of this painting and look at it. It's one of the late self-portraits. It's from about 68 or so. And just to look at, for example, a detail of it here. Oh, sorry. Rembrandt's looking at me as much as I'm looking at him. And it's amazing. It's amazing because it's so coarsely painted, and he wanted it that way. He's just wallowing in that wonderful oil paint, which he had done his whole life. It's an amazing, it's a presentation. And the point is, you got to go to the museum. For example, you go to the Worcester Art Museum to see the freak portraits, or we have the first self-portrait in America, Thomas Smith, the first selfie, not a photograph, but a painting. And when you stand in front of that, first of all, you're the only, you and the people in front of it are the only people in the world that are seeing the original object, not on a smartphone, reduced in size, maybe distorted in color, not seeing the real texture, the frame, whatever. So it's a special moment, I think, when you go to a museum and see a self-portrait of an artist. And conservators at museums do everything to preserve the original object. The painting might have been touched up by someone later on who didn't want to see the self-portrait, the artist with a cigarette in his hand, for example. And we uncover that. We're always getting back to the original. But that's how the artist wanted to be seen, at least that day or those years of his life. Okay, let's look at Rembrandt's life. He was born in Leiden, which is the university town, still one of the great schools of Europe or the world. His father was a miller, and his father was of the Dutch Reform, the Calvinist religion. His mother was Catholic, and she descended from a baker's family. He went to the Latin school in Leiden, and he also went 1 year at age 14 to the university. And then he turned his talents to painting. He worked under 3 different artists. The one who influenced him the most, fortunately we have a painting, oh there you see Leiden, And that, I should tell you, that's an early etching of Rembrandt, but also that's the Lachenhall, which is now the Museum of Leiden. It's a repurposed building, but it's the building where they dealt with all the textile industry, which was a major industry at the time. This is a painting by Rembrandt's teacher, and very grateful to Jack and Ruth Adam, who bought that and then gave it to the Worcester Art Museum. It's dated 1619, it's so right when Rembrandt would be studying with him, and it's a mythological subject, Paris and Oenone. So you can look at that at the museum. These are the, I'm sorry they're being cut off at the bottom there, but they're all dated. Hopefully you can bear with. But these are when he's just a young man, and these are etchings that he did. I'm sorry, the dates are there, but they're cut off. Leslie, we can't change that anyway, can we?
No.
Maybe not, okay. You'll see, this is a, a teenager, and these are all etchings. Now, here's another one. Basically from the 1620s, late 20s. He would have looked in a mirror. This is a 17th century Dutch mirror to do these. Now, the advantage of etching is, one, that if you're left-handed or right-handed, whatever you are, when you print, it reverses it out. But when you draw it, it's the reverse because you're looking at yourself in a mirror, right? Okay? And there's always studies on, was Rembrandt left-handed or right-handed? For a long time, they thought he was left-handed. I think I know why. I'll show you a print that probably led to that, but we are now quite sure he's right-handed. That's when you start examining the strokes, like with, for example, Leonardo da Vinci, left-handed. Etching is an amazing technique. How many have done printmaking at all? No printmaking even in high school, potato print, or no? A few linoleum print, yeah. I know you're not an expert, Lee, but you did it. But let me just quickly tell you about engraving, in fact, or an etching. Let me see if I have, there we go. Here is not a Rembrandt plate, but an artist who made a print, a plate, and copied a Rembrandt just so she could actually print from it. And you can see when it's printed, it's in reverse, just lifting the paper there. But basically, you take a copper plate, and originally, you did engraving. And that's truly amazing, because what they would do is they take a burin, which is a little sharp tool, and you draw while you're removing the metal. You're drawing in, you're carving into the metal plate. And that was really the medium to use for printing from a copper plate up until the 16th and 17th century when etching came along. Now, with both processes, what you do, once you dig out those grooves, then you put ink in on that plate, right? And then you take the ink off of the surface, put a moist piece of paper on it, pass it through a press, and there you have the reversed image, which, if it's reversed, it's convenient because your left hand is now still your left hand, right? Because you were looking in a mirror when you did it. You follow that? Yeah. Okay, what is etching? Well, etching is easier to do because you take a copper plate and you put sort of, it's like a waxy substance over it, rosin, and then you take a needle and you just draw. And as you're drawing, you're removing the wax, okay? Much easier than carving it. And then you put it into an acid bath. And where that wax has been removed, the acid eats the plate, and you get an etched line. Okay? Then you heat the plate, the wax comes off, same process. Ink it up, and then put paper on, and you can do over and over again. Now, you can also look at your first proof, as we call it, and say, oh, I have a little more shadow under the eye, or whatever. You can re-etch the plate. Rembrandt did it many, many times, and all of those have been cataloged many, many years ago now, and we call those states: first state, second state, third state, fourth state. And most of Rembrandt's prints, there's 3 or 4 states, and we know, for example, of the Rembrandt prints that we have what state it is, because it might be just one little line under the eye that he wants to add more character, whatever. So know that that's what he's doing early in his career, and many of these prints are only about this big or smaller. It's a great way of getting his image out there, of course. Here is a mirror from the time. You can see it in a painting from the middle of the 17th century. The other framed object is a painting of a seascape, and the woman there is reading a letter she's gotten from, I would suspect, her lover, who's probably at sea, Men would be gone for years at a time, not knowing if they're ever going to come back. You'll notice also how they protected their paintings in those days with a curtain from the light and the dust. And so think about it. When you went to look at a painting, it's almost like turning on the TV. You really looked at it. You really looked at it. And then you put the curtain back. And that's probably why observation skills are dwindling in our society. We don't look at anything in depth, and we don't really scrutinize the image, right? We have so many images. It is interesting to note that mirrors got bigger in size as we moved into the 17th century. So you get, and it does affect the shape of the painting, or the more of the figure being shown, particularly for a self-portrait. Okay. Well, are these selfies? Here you see Rembrandt tucked in with people of our own time, where we, with our smartphones, can take all these self-portraits. And we talk a lot about selfies in my class, because dealing with portraits, and you know, you might think it's all about vanity, but it isn't. Much of it is this takes the place of a diary, which many of you did, or maybe your grandparents did. And yeah, I'm sure a lot is about vanity, and I can tell you these kids know how to pose on a, because sometimes you get that camera too close, your nose seems bigger, or whatever. They know how to compensate. But is that what Rembrandt is doing? Clearly, he was vain like anyone. And we know this from some of his portraits where he sort of disguises his rather bulbous nose with shadows to make it look more slender. He doesn't have surgery to do at that point. But he also used these self-portraits to prepare for doing history paintings, mythological subjects, religious paintings, which were still popular in Holland. And I should mention, I've talked about this before, but this is a new art market in 17th century Holland. It's no longer the church or the state, the chief client of the artist. It's the art market as we know today, the rich and the rising middle class. Put yourself where you want. And what do you want? You might want a history painting, you might want a religious subject, Old Testament, New Testament, but you will also probably want portraits, for sure. You will, like the royalty did before you, or the popes, and you will want paintings of your ships, your landscapes, your still lifes, your objects, all that. And so Rembrandt, like all the other artists in Holland, is primarily painting for an open market, producing art for an open market. He's got to make these works very convincing. So what he does in these portraits, as you maybe see here in this one, you can see the date 29 to 33, he starts to make expressions. For example, here, like a little surprise, right? I think that's a beautiful one. And again, it's only about that big. Because he knows when he's happy or when he's sad. And you know, we have something like, I don't know, 3,000 or more combinations in your face with your eyes, your nose, your mouth. Maybe you can wiggle your ears, I don't know. But it's amazing how many expressions we can make on our face. Sorry. And so we do this in class. I won't have you do it, but I'll have some of the kids who want to go into theater come up in front of the class. Of course, they all start giggling, but look angry, and you can see what happens. All of this has been studied in modern times. But this is what Rembrandt is really doing. Or, for example, disgust. See how your mouth changes. Or sadness. Or joy. I always say to students, if you're wondering, you're in the museum and you're looking at any painting from any period, and you wonder how that person feels, just take that pose, or do that expression. Just do it for yourself. Now, I'm looking at you. But all of you, look angry. I saw how your eyes went in your mouth. Look suspicious. Yeah, usually your eyes go to the side. Just do it now. Look straight away and then do your eyes to the side. Immediately, you feel differently. Yeah. This is what Rembrandt's into right now. And here you see it a little more in these little engraved etchings. Yeah, are there. And here we see a painting where he puts himself right in the paintings. This is the stoning of St. Stephen. And here he's the tormentor. Here you can see a couple, not that they're the ones for this particular painting, but you see 4 Rembrandt-like people stoning St. Stephen. And let's look at it in another painting where it's not him, but he's learned to study facial expressions. It's one of my favorite paintings. I remember taking my parents, their only trip to Europe, into the museum, and they were elderly at the time, and they just loved this painting. You know, they were a happily married couple, as this couple is in this painting. But if let's look closer, this is Tobin and Anna, the old subject painting, which would have been popular in a Calvinist country. And if I asked you, what's the expression on her face? Anyone have ideas?
Quizzical. She's
Quizzical.
concerned.
Concern. What? Is that what you said? Yeah?
Frightened.
Yeah?
Fear.
And what about him?
Guilty.
Hmm?
Guilty.
Guilty? Oh, because he's got his hand, yeah. And you have to put the whole combination together, because, you know, we pray and we're happy, we pray when we're sad. Well, I'll be very quick about it because we'll be here all day, but the story, maybe you all know, is that Tobin and Anna were this couple were together, and let's bring back the big picture here. You can see they're not wealthy people, they're still wearing old clothes, his shoes are falling apart, and he's blind. He's blind. Yeah. And he and she is making her living by the spinning wheel, all textile work, something that Rembrandt would have known about from his hometown. And she's coming back with a kid that she is bringing so they can eat this kid. This is going to be the food supply for the winter or whatever. And he thinks she's stolen it. Yeah. He can't see, of course. And you notice even the little dog at his side has bells around his collar. It's a sweet painting. And you see the spinning wheel behind. Everything's there to tell the story. And the expression, too. All of a sudden, and this is the subject that Rembrandt would love, or any, well, we still love these tragic moments. Why do we watch the soaps in the afternoon? Maybe you do, I don't, but and maybe you don't either. I think you're too busy for it. But, you know, we love films that deal with tragedy. And, you know, here's someone who, they've trusted each other their whole life, and now there's this break. And hopefully he will understand, but he's mistrusting her right now. But it's the expression, the wide open eyes, and him who can't see. You can see he's grasping to see, but he can't, his wrinkled brow, all of that. Or like, for example, here, in this painting here of Jeremiah, weeping over the destruction of Jerusalem, and I'll just bring up a close-up, because it's not just the wrinkled brow, and in this case he puts shadow in one eye and the other, which gives it a little bit of feeling, but also the way the position of the hand and the head and all that. It all helps to tell the story. And you have to realize that painting and printmaking and drawing were the highest form of expression in 17th century Holland. Yes, you had writers, but you have a country, a melting pot country, where not everyone read Dutch or spoke Dutch, coming from all countries all over the world. And the visual arts really were the highest form of expression. They tell a lot, if you can read a picture. And these people, they could read these much better than we do. Not just because they lived back then, but they actually looked and studied them. Rembrandt did do self-portraits in oil. This is one of the most powerful ones from early in his career. Sort of the classic adolescent. You don't get to see his eyes really until you really look close up, and then it's hard to see. And notice how, in painting his hair, how creative he is as a young man. While the background's still wet, he turns the brush around and uses the poked end, the wooden end, and just scrapes into the wet paint to create those curly parts. Right here, you see? Or here, and when he scrapes here, you get the dark background, and here you get the lighter background. It's just a fun way of painting. And think about that when we look at the late works, because Rembrandt will have by then been painting 40 years in oil. It's his form of expression. It's what he loves to do. I know there are some painters here in the audience, and he's a painter's painter. You still feel him painting there when you look at these works of art. Oops. Or here, one that you can see when you go to Boston. This is at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. And here is a good example of how he used lighting to make his face more slender, right? Yeah. He has a rather chubby face, but not only that, the hat, the feather. This, I think, is a little more vanity. He's all dressed up, You can see here, and he uses light to add to the drama. I've been working with teenagers for many years, and our Art All-State program, which is now, what, 34 years old, at Worcester. These are high school kids that come and work with professional artists for 2 full weeks. It's now at the university. And one of the things is that they have to submit a self-portrait as part of their getting into the program. And none of them is the same. And they're so expressive. They're so amazing. Whether they're painting, a photograph, or you name it, these are just one of thousands that were done over the years. I'd love to do something with that, track these kids down. We did that over the years, like in the 16th year we were in touch with a number of the students to see what they were doing, and some were working for Walt Disney, but some were doctors, lawyers, running their own marketing company. It's not just because they were interested in art as a teenager, they're going to make a living that way. Well, here's an early work by Rembrandt. It's on a copper plate, not very large. They did paint on copper, not always, but usually on wood and canvas. And this was acquired by the Getty Museum in California not too long ago. Here you see Rembrandt is laughing, young man. Also notice he's wearing part of a suit of armor, a gorget. And this, clearly it's Rembrandt's likeness, but in the 17th century they might have thought of this as what they call a tronie. It's a Dutch word which comes from a French word which really means a face. And so, you know, when you're starting out particularly, you can't afford to have models, so you look in the mirror and you're going to paint a portrait, or let's say it's maybe a historical picture where you need soldiers, you just dress up like one, right? For example, here you see it close up, but this may well be a tronie. And here are examples of tronies, sorry, that's the word there at the top, including the Vermeer, the girl with the pearl earring. It could be the likeness of Vermeer's, one of his many children, he had 11 of them. But the reason we think it's probably a tronie, or refer to it as that, and it's more of an art historical term, is that she's wearing this turban, which is not contemporary fashion. Or the Brouwer over there where he's making a face, he's probably preparing for one of his tavern scenes or whatever. Or the one on the right, Kreisbeck, that's actually a self-portrait of him. And he did a lot of low-life scenes of people in taverns, smoking, etc. Tronie. We do have a pair of paintings at the Worcester Art Museum that I think are tronies. It's clearly a self-portrait by Frans van Mieris, who is a contemporary of Vermeer. He did incredibly detailed paintings. I will tell you that these are on wood panels and they're only this big. Look how detailed. Where I am, I can even see the smoke coming out of the corner of his mouth. And that's his wife tweaking the ear of a dog. So these would be good detailed paintings to maybe prepare for doing a genre scene, a scene of everyday life. And we know that Frans van Mieris put himself into many of those paintings. Well, Rembrandt leaves his hometown and goes to Amsterdam. And this is when Amsterdam is really taking off. It's often referred to as the Venice of the North. That was the title they gave to Antwerp in the southern Netherlands, who remained Catholic and loyal to Spain. But the Dutch did a dirty trick. They cut off the Scheldt River, which connected Antwerp to the North Sea. And that made Amsterdam just flourish. And gave it the link to the world. As you can see, it's on the Zuiderzee, which has now been, half of that's reclaimed in land, but it really had access to the sea because of well, what you usually call the IJsselmeer Lake. In any case, major city, and right away he gets great portraits, commissions. This one is of a gentleman, and it's a painting at the Frick collection, Nicholas Rutz, 1631, and I think you could guess what the business of this man is. He's in the fur trading business. He's got the fur hat, he's got the fur on his jacket there and the sleeves, and he was doing work with Russia, where so many of the furs came from. And it's a very detailed painting, which is typical of Rembrandt's early career. Almost feels like the paint is now the fur, or it is the linen of the collar, or the skin. That changes when later on you'll see you feel mainly paint. it's amazing that Rembrandt got this commission in 1632, not that long after he arrived in Amsterdam. It's the famous painting of the Dr. Tulp's anatomy lesson. It's really a Board of Trustees group portrait, but look how interesting he makes it, how much better it is than any of those group portraits you've been in when you've served on boards. You all line up, you sit in rows. He makes this an interesting painting on top of it. At the same time, everyone's well documented. They all paid for this, so. And at the same time, he distinguishes who's the most important there. That's Dr. Tulp. Not only is he the only one on the right side of the painting, but he's the only one with the hat on. And he's also shown dissecting an arm because he studied with Vesalius in Italy, who was the first to dissect an arm. He wants to show his resume, if you will, his pedigree. And it's interesting, much research has been done on this painting. It's at the Maurits House in The Hague, that we even know who the cadaver is. And it's from the same town as Rembrandt, Leiden. But he did bad things. He was executed because of assault and battery. And this was the way they felt that he might be able to get into heaven. To quote, not that he did it himself, but sacrifice his body for medical purposes or scientific purposes. And you can see how the Dutch were leading in so many areas. Here also in medicine. Here you see a close-up. How interesting he makes each of those faces. He's a master at this. And he's not that old at this point. He quickly rises to fame. And he gets portraits like these, a wealthy couple, pair of portraits, and you can see they're connected by the man handing the glove to the woman. Wonderful paintings. Rembrandt had more pupils than anyone else in all of Holland. And here you see a drawing that one of his pupils did where he's surrounded by both young and old students working from a model. It's interesting that so many of his pupils also copied Rembrandt's self-portraits, which were then sold. For example, here, the one I believe on the left is from the Maurits House. The other one is in a museum in Germany, and for a long time they thought the one on the left was the original, but the other one, I might have them reversed here now that I think of it. But anyway, one's now thought to be the original, and the other, it would be a pupil of Rembrandt. This is how he made money. And it's like the painting that we have at the Worcester Art Museum. It's signed Rembrandt, but we think maybe one of his pupils worked on it as well. Not only did he charge his pupils money, or their parents, to study with him, but then he was able to sell their works with his name on it. He became very, very wealthy. Right. Yeah, it was a great way to work. But unlike today, when you were an artist, you wanted to paint like your master, because he had a brand. And today, most teachers will say, don't do like I do, express yourself. It's a different kind of way of working. But when the camera wasn't there, and portraiture was really, here's our painting, which is signed on the knife there of St. Bartholomew, who was flayed alive, and that's why he's holding a knife. Well, here you see a portrait of Rembrandt on the left, 1633, and now he's at really, so quickly, almost at the height of his fame. It goes on for another decade. And you'll see him wearing a nice velvet hat, a gold chain, which people were given, you know, as a sort of a reference to being a successful individual. And then on the right, you see one of a series of paintings he got as a commission. And he got this commission from the Secretary of State of Holland. Think about that. And here you see the group of paintings. They're not that large. They're scattered in different museums. But I'm going to show you one close-up. And it's with this commission is the one or two sentences we have that Rembrandt actually wrote something. And he talks about how he wants to include very expressive work through the lighting, etc. But here you see being taken down from the cross, again, his own likeness. And you just put an etching there next to it. You might say, well, why is he the person tormenting Christ or tormenting St. Stephen? Well, it became sort of fashionable to put yourself in the role of the villain. Okay? Yeah. It's in a way of redeeming yourself, too. Well, it is this time, at this time, they meet Saskia van Uylenburg, a very sophisticated woman, who's a relative of an art dealer he goes to live with in Amsterdam in the beginning. And They fall in love. Here's a portrait he did of her. But the one that I love so much is inscribed. And here again, one of the few inscriptions we have of Rembrandt's beside signature. And it says, "This is the likeness of my wife, Saskia, aged 21 years old, made the 3rd day after our betrothal, June 8th, 1633. Here's the detail. This is a woman in love. And he captured it so well with just a few lines. This is a silver point drawing, which is a technique not used much today, but basically you prepare the paper with, it's like a ground bone substance, and then you take a metal point like a needle and draw with that. It's like if you took a coin and you went on the side of a White House, maybe you did that when you were a kid, and it makes gray lines, right? Yeah, and over time those gray lines oxidize and create a beautiful color, and we love it. Anyway, he also did portraits of her dressed up. She was his model. Here you see both as Flora, the beautiful mythological figure. And then this painting, which is pretty interesting because he puts his wife in a rather compromising position. You probably know that here she is, the prostitute. This is Rembrandt drinking away. You can see he's got a pass glass. This is a glass with different marks on it that maybe you use one of those in college where you pass it around, drink to the line, and keep on drinking until you get a little high. Yeah. The painting was cut down a little bit on the left. We now, well, we knew a long time ago that Rembrandt is referring to the prodigal son. This the Dutch called the verloren zoon, the lost son. You know the story of the father who had 2 children, a wealthy father who gave them equal amounts of money. The one, rambunctious one, went out and lived a wild life, visited the house of prostitution, bought fancy clothes, as you can see here, his hat as well, and spent his money on loose living, and ended up with no money, eating with the pigs, and then went back home. Now this was a popular subject, and you can see Rembrandt puts himself in the role of the villain, if you will, the bad guy. It's a subject that was for theater. Here you see the playbill for a play in Amsterdam, Verloren Zoon, Prodigal Son, at the Amsterdam Academy in 1630. Here you see that print on the cover, and I'm going to show you that many of the same elements are in Vermeer's painting. In fact, at the right there, you see a woman marking up on a chalkboard, or some kind of board, the number of drinks that the client has. And that's a nice detail in the painting on by Rembrandt, because it shows he's not in his own home, he's in a public building. And that part of the painting did get trimmed, but that's still there. And then back on the table is a peacock pie. They actually, like a chicken pie, but they would decorate it with the peacock feathers. Beautiful objects. You see them in still lifes of the period. And this would be a symbol of pride as well. Again, he's putting himself and his wife in a precarious role. And he loved doing this. He has a sense of humor. He's young. Would he do it later on? He'd probably do anything later on. But anyway, here you see Caravaggio doing a similar thing. That's a self-portrait on the right. And there you see in 2 paintings where he's depicted David and Goliath, and he puts himself not as David, but as Goliath, the man who was executed. Yeah. While we show you the painting on the left, we have to always refer to the one done late in his life, one of the masterpieces at the Hermitage in Russia, where the prodigal son returns to his father, who accepts him home. You can see he has only one shoe at that point that works, and there's the brother who's not so happy the other brothers come home, but it's a lesson about forgiveness and fatherly love. Well, here you see Saskia in an etching, and I think this is maybe the print that made people think that he was left-handed, because while the drawing would show he's the reverse, the etching, because the printing process reverses it back, and because of the mirror, you can see there. But we do know he seems to be just holding in his left hand here. This is actually a porte-crayon, which is a mechanical device. You can hold 2 pieces of chalk, a light, white and black, or red and white, whatever you want, that they were using at that time. Well, let's look at some more etchings. These are from the mid to late 30s. And here you see him dressing up like a king and in these fancy clothes. He's showing off. He's got all the money in the world at this point now. He's famous. Not all the money in the world, but he's doing well. He's doing well. And he buys a major house in the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam. And that's where he was able to mingle with the Jews and actually painted images of Christ looking like a Jew, not looking like an Aryan. And I'm sorry for the building at the left, this modern building, but only because it's right next to that wonderful 17th century building that is Rembrandt's home. How many people have visited it? You don't want to miss it your next trip to Amsterdam. It's the Rembrandt House Museum now. And every year it gets better and better. They acquire more works of art, but you can go in his studio, you can see where these works were painted. Just don't miss it. Fabulous. This would be a very expensive home. It'd be like buying a house in Boston right now, in the Back Bay. Yeah. This is a house, well, you would have to, if you were investing in tulip bulbs, if you had the right tulip bulb, you could buy this tulip bulb. But to buy you could buy the house. But to buy the tulip bulb, if you were a common laborer, you would have to be working for, maybe for this house, 30 years. Yeah. So he's living well, and here's two paintings he does at this time. He buys a house in 39, this is 1640. 30, and the print and the painting are from the same period. And you can see he's, very composed. He's in rich clothing, velvet hat, fur, all of that. He's very confident. It's a wonderful portrait. It clearly relates to this painting, which comes from the Renaissance. This is by Raphael. It's a portrait of Baldassare Castiglione, the great courtier. And we know a lot about his life. And this is how he wanted to be portrayed, as the gentleman, sophisticated, in nice clothes. And this painting was on the market in Amsterdam, and Rembrandt saw it, and that's the sketch. It's again the few lines that he wrote on one of the drawings. So he saw it firsthand. So while he never went to Italy, he got to see art that was being brought up from the south to the north. He wasn't the only person that saw it. Rubens saw it when it was in Antwerp earlier on. And this is the painting that Rubens, the great master from Antwerp, did of it. He also saw this painting by Titian, who was another artist he admired so much because Titian used such a bold brushwork as well, as he got older in particular. But he was clearly fascinated by these two paintings, and they certainly influenced the print as well as the oil painting. I'll bring that one back. You can see. So while he didn't get to Italy, he's influenced by Renaissance art as well. This is about the time, 2 years later, that he does what is probably his most famous work, The Midnight Watch. This is the masterpiece in the Rijksmuseum, and we won't go into it in detail, but you can see it's a group portrait, and you'll notice the two important people in the foreground, the Lieutenant de Ruyter and Captain Benningcock. Do you notice anything about the two men? These are the things, if you look closely, look how short the one is compared to the other. But you're not aware of that, at least right in the beginning, because Rembrandt, first of all, think about how big this painting is. But you'll notice, let me go back, and I think I had myself over here. You can see that he gives the shorter man the yellow cap, the lighter one, which makes him stand out more and seem taller, whereas he makes the other one a black cap, which disappears into the background. Okay? But let's look at this painting. First of all, the painting was cut down, unfortunately. You can see it's missing a little bit of the top, more at the left, and a little bit on the right. It was taken out of the original hall it was done for a duel in the military building, put into another building where it just didn't quite fit, so they just cut it down. That happened to a lot of paintings by Rembrandt. We'll see one more before we finish today. Why we know this is because it was copied by one of his pupils on the right, and you can see that in the original composition, the captain and the lieutenant were not at the center of the painting, they were coming into the center. It was like a performance. It was like theater. And the arch in the back was the center of the painting, so they're coming into the middle of that arch. Look really closely, really closely. I don't think you can see it from where you are. First there's the two important people, and then way in the background, There's one more person. You see the eye popping up? You see the eye there? This parchment, we think that might be Rembrandt, putting himself into the picture. Well, Rembrandt had his wife Saskia gave birth to 4 children. Unfortunately, 3 of them died very young, right after childbirth, which happened so often at that time. 1 survived, and that's Titus. You see the subject of both of these paintings. And he was born in 1641. And Saskia died a few months later. We think of tuberculosis. I think that's what most people feel today. And so Rembrandt was a single dad. And so he had his housekeeper, and we have, let's see here, well, there's the last portraits of Saskia. And what's really touching was, are the drawings he did when she's in bed, literally dying. And, you know, we're so lucky to be here, we're so lucky to live in the 21st century. But think about being ill in 17th century Holland. And she's in bed all day, I would suppose, and they know she's not going to survive. And these are a whole group of sketches we have of her as he saw her pass away. And so this is the woman who was the housekeeper at the time, and her name is Gertje Dirksen. We're not absolutely sure, but most art historians think this is the sketch that's probably her. In any case, and there's probably 2 sides to the story, and you know, it was pretty much a man's world back then, so I don't want to, I want to be fair here. She was the wet nurse, but also the lover for Rembrandt very quickly, but she did some bad things. She actually, he gave her some of Saskia's jewelry and then she sold it. He was obviously very ticked about that. And then even her relatives accused her of doing very bad things. So I think he thought she was pretty unstable and needed to be committed to some kind of institution. So she was committed to a house of correction, which was, you know, a tough life for her. She did get out a little earlier on than she was supposed to. But then he brings in another person to take care of his only son. Oh, I should mention that she was, of course, very irritated because he never married her. Okay? She was his common law wife in a way. But there's a reason he didn't marry her, because Saskia had left an inheritance for Titus. And if he would marry her, the son would lose all that. Yeah. So then, when she leaves the house, he takes up with Hendrika Stoffels. And she's in a number of his paintings, and this seems to be a wonderful relationship. She manages business as well, very well, and she figures in historical paintings, mythological paintings as well. In any case, unfortunately for Rembrandt, now think about it, here is the most famous artist in certainly Holland, one of the most famous artists in Europe. And the Painters Guild did not like this, that he had a common law wife. He should be marrying her. But he didn't want to marry her for the same reason, to protect his son. But she was referred to as a whore. That would be hard to take if you're this very public figure. And so, here you see a closer up of this. But there are people who, you know, didn't want to have anything to do with Rembrandt. And then there are people who stood by him, such as Jan Six, the mayor of Amsterdam. No one less than that. This is this great portrait he did of Jan Six. I have seen it. I don't know if you can do this anymore, but it used to be that you could get a ticket at the Rijksmuseum and go to the Jan Six house, which is right on the Amstel River. You can walk to there from the Rijksmuseum and see it where it has always hung. And it's such a wonderful painting because here is Rembrandt taking advantage of not only bold brushwork, such as the way he's painting the hands, like the man's just putting his gloves on, ready to go outside, but also this very thoughtful head, as you see, through very subtle glazes, etc. And then the same kind of thing he does in his own self-portraits. This is one of the masterpieces at the Frick Collection in New York. Now you see full-length portrait. We know that Rembrandt got full-length mirrors, or bigger mirrors, let me say. And we know Titus helped him buy that. Now Titus is growing up, and Titus figures in his paintings as helping his father. But about this time, Rembrandt declares bankruptcy. He's obviously not getting the commissions he used to get. and he has to sell the big house. And he moves to a much smaller house, and he goes bankrupt in 1656, 57, sells the house the following year, 58, and then even in 1660, he sets up sort of what we would call a dummy arrangement that his son Titus manages his business. It made it more legal because he had just declared bankruptcy. Here you see him in a self-portrait. These are the portraits we love to study because here's a man who's lived, he's had clearly his ups and now he's having his downs. A man who's really lived in life. This is the house he had to sell. But he still gets major commissions. And he gets the commission for the town hall, which has just opened. This was considered one of the great wonders of the world, to build a building that big on land reclaimed from the sea. And this is a sketch that we have for the big painting he was going to do, okay? He did it, but unfortunately the final work was cut up and we have only a fragment of it. I'm going to show it to you right here on the right. Let me overlap it to the drawing so you can see we have a much smaller fragment. The overall painting will be taller than this room, okay? But I'm going to put it next to, here you see it, and it's very crudely done. And he does it intentionally because this is part of the conspiracy of Claudius Civilis, who was a medieval figure, and they're looking back because now Holland is a very important, one of the most important countries in the world, and this is like early history. This would be like looking at the American Revolution for us. And these are the men gathering in the woods with their swords, obviously very primitive life, pledging their allegiance to their leader. And this coarse kind of painting adds to this medieval quality, as you can see. On the right are two paintings done by two of his students. You can see a very different style of painting. Much brighter colors, more like French style painting now, because France was becoming a very powerful country. And so even his pupils were turning away from him and going to the more popular style of the day. And so not only does his lover, Hendrik Stoffel, pass away in 1663, but even his own son the year before he himself died. Titus dies in 1668. So here we will look at, and this is where we'll wrap up, the late self-portraits. This is the one that I always like looking at when I go to the National Gallery. Here's some more from that same period. These we're not even sure that they were finished because they were found in his studio. Work like this. Or this one. Or this one. This one in particular is probably the last of the self-portraits. And here you see him laughing. And you'll see another figure at the upper left. We're not sure who that is. Is it a painting? Is it a sculpture? But clearly it's in there for a purpose. Some people think it represents the god Terminus. You can see he was put on a post, like a marker at the end of a border, or end of your property. But obviously he's at the end of his life, so it could have further meaning. It could also be that this painting on the left is referring to the laughing and the weeping philosophers, Heraclitus and Democritus. Looking at life, you know, there's two ways you can look at life. You can have a sense of humor, or you could be very morbid about it. Things don't go always the way you want it. And here you see them both depicted with globes. One happy, one sad. And it's interesting, particularly to put this next to one of his earlier self-portraits, the one at the Getty, where he's laughing. And then you have this great painting, which is the Kenwood House. And I have to tell you, this is a lesson to all of you. I'm showing you slides here. You got to go look at these paintings in the flesh. And because I had been working on this talk for Kenwood House, and I'm not giving you that talk, it was more detailed on this painting, for some months over the summer. And then when I went to the museum, I had been to the museum before, I'd seen the painting, but they have it isolated in a room all by itself for the 350th anniversary. And here I am, and I'll do this. I walked over to the painting, and it's a little bit smaller than you see it here. And I was just in front of it, and the painting really enveloped me. Not only that, but the texture of the paint. And the room was semi-dark, and I'm thinking, this is how it would have been seen in the 17th century. And I have to tell you that the reason that they wanted me to give the talk was because of the circles in the background. And I thought, who cares about those circles? No, we all care about those circles. but you are just enveloped in that face of Rembrandt. And the circles are significant, and I'm going to get into that in a moment. But what I want to do first is to show you, these are the kind of paintings when he's at the height of his career, okay? Late 1630s, early 40s. And you see, in all of these, he's wearing a chain. He's proud of that gold chain. He was awarded that because he was a great painter. It's here in this painting, but you hardly see it. It's just tucked away. You didn't even see that. Just a few strokes of sort of an ochre color into his jacket there. So, what are the circles? Well, some people thought right away it's a map. And many people have debunked that since I went. They really wanted me to come and talk about maps. But you can see wall maps of that 17th century. This is a map that Rembrandt could have used. This is one that would have been available to him. And you can see that the southern hemispheres are usually joined on the maps. And they're always joined, I shouldn't say usually. But I thought, I'll do a little research on this since now they really wanted me to talk about this. And so I have a wall map in my home. And I asked my brother-in-law, who was staying with me at that point, he and my sister, and I'll tell you, my brother-in-law will say, I'm not an artist. He and his wife, my sister, are international artists. This is Richard Surrey. He was the legal counsel for the National Security Agency when he was a young man, and then he and his wife, my sister, spent 20 years in Europe, and now they're over here helping us politically. I had him go up on my third floor and sit in front of the map that is a reproduction of a map which I've published from the 17th century. You can see how beautiful they were. I also saw in the last years how we put this map together about 20 years ago, how the varnish has gotten darker and darker. So, okay, there you see him in front of it, and you see the circles are very different, right? But something you always learn from doing this. I have him holding one of my old, well, just a little palette and the brushes and the maul stick, which is a stick with a little soft tip on it that you can put on the painting, lean on it so you can steady your hand if you want to. Rembrandt really didn't need that much because he was painting so boldly. But my brother-in-law is not about to paint your self-portrait, and I don't think you want him to do. He wanted me to inform anyone I showed this to. But anyway, so what I did was I extended those circles to see what that map would look like in size. Now here you see it, if it had no decoration around the sides. But by the 17th century, most of them had ornamentation, so they'd be much larger. And it was actually a lesson for me doing this exercise, because I could see that that map, most of these maps, the largest are 4 by 6 feet, which is large. And you have to be very wealthy to own one of these. But this would probably be bigger than one of the walls in his studio. As you can see, it's really large, if it were an original map. So, okay, so it's maybe not a reference to a map. What is it? What's he doing in this painting? Well, this has already been suggested that maybe those circles refer, first of all, to Giotto, who was able to do a perfect circle, okay? Or the ancient artist Apelles, who could do a perfect circle, okay? And there are 2 circles. And there's a story in ancient history with Apelles that he left a circle and another artist came in the studio and did another perfect circle, because it could well refer to that. On the other hand, the circle on the left is not a perfect circle in the painting, okay? And they're also done rather sketchily. They're not like you would do. So, still, the jury's out. But what about this print that Rembrandt did earlier of a printing master, a writing master? Some of you do calligraphy. This is a master at this. And if you look closer, you can see he's doing a circle on a piece of paper. And then you look at the back wall, there's a circle. But in the final print that Rembrandt did of this, he eliminated the circle on the back wall. So that raises a couple questions there. So what are the circles? Who knows for sure? The painting has been x-rayed. But I have to say, when you look at the painting, you're just absorbed by the face. He's examining you as much as you're examining him. So let's look at, again, these are the early self-portraits, the late self-portraits, and here you see the early ones above, the lower ones below. I like to compare this to a painting that you can all see at the museum, at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It's one of the earliest self-portraits of Rembrandt. There he is in his studio. It's a fabulous painting. And let's bring him up closer. Well, before I do, you can see that the subject of the painting is really creativity. We don't get to see the painting. He wants to keep you guessing, right? And you see the edge of the painting, it's like that white line. And even the easel and the painting is bigger than the artist, which happens. When the work goes around the world, your art becomes bigger than you, more important than you. It lives beyond you. And then look at here. Here he is, young man. He's now feeling his oats. He's dressed in expensive clothing. You know, that blue dye is expensive. He's holding the same instruments in the later painting. There he is with the palette, the brushes, and the maul stick. You see another 2 palettes on the back wall, and then that stone thing behind him is where he would grind the paints. He would have had students do that when he became a master and had a lot of assistants. So maybe you didn't notice, and maybe it's cut off here, and it is, I'm sorry, but there is an edge of a painting in the painting on the right. Let me see if I can bring that. I'm sorry. You have to trust me, there's a little bit of a canvas on the right. And the x-rays show that originally he had his hand extended out, was painting on that painting. And he took that away. Could it be that the circles are just a way of making up for that empty space in between? He had already painted himself, he's not going to redo that? Could be. There you see, now you see it on the edge? You see you can see the canvas there. Well, let's finish up by looking again and considering that this is a late self-portrait of Rembrandt, as you see in these here. The only artist who did as many self-portraits, interestingly enough, is also a Dutch artist, and that's Vincent van Gogh. You all know him. Quite different, however. He did these over a much shorter period of time, not over 40 years, but over 7 years. And he did 36 in 7 years. They're all on the screen here. And they're really a self-study of his life, and you know he had a very troubled life. Let's take one at the end of his life, the year before he passed away, before he killed himself, and put it next to the Rembrandt. It's very instructive. First of all, they're both at the end of their career, and they're painting very boldly. They're using their self-portrait to study themselves. Also, I think this is the real key. They're both showing us the challenges and the pride in being an artist. The challenges, painting with paint, to create something that's so real, something that's so penetrating, that can reveal your inner personal. And even with Rembrandt, and here, think about it, this is just the year after he lost his son. You have the juxtaposition here of a youthful boy and then an older man, where the texture of the paint is like the texture of his skin even. Rembrandt died in 1669, 350 years ago, as a poor man. He had no family left. He was put in an unmarked grave in Westerkerk, there you see in the painting on the right. In fact, a number of years later, his grave was dug up and his bones were tossed away because it was a grave they would reuse again. Sadly, yeah. His rise was as fast as his fall in a way. And that's the beauty of putting these two paintings together. They tell you a lot about his life. And it also shows you that Rembrandt does live on in his self-portraits. Thank you.